Welcome to the Sports Scouting Report podcast with Lee Burkeen.
Hi, everyone. We're recording. You're listening to the Sports Scouting Report. I'm your host, Lee Burkeen. Today's topics, we're going to talk about LSU football players that are going pro early or returning, getting that extra year from the NCAA. And also the bowl games, go over all the bowl games, the interesting bowl games, mostly the SEC bowl games. And then talk about LSU basketball. It's going to be a fun show. Hope everybody had a great holidays for Christmas and a great New Year's. I've got to realize that it's now 2021. It's not 2020. So if I go out there and I got to realize it's a new year, just like everybody else. But we're going to go ahead and get into the bowl games. And let's talk about bowl games that everybody watched over the holidays. I love bowl season. I really do. Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite hobbies during the holidays to be able to watch the teams play different teams, from different conferences. The Pac-12 against the SEC, or the Big Ten against the SEC, or the Big 12 against the Pac-12. And there were a lot of games that didn't play, but I think considering a lot of the major bowl games were able to be played, I think the only one that really didn't get to be played in the SEC, obviously, was Arkansas. They weren't able to play TCU. Both teams decided not to play their bowl game. That would have been a good game, TCU against Arkansas, pretty evenly matched. But the biggest thing about the bowl games, and I think a lot of the listeners would probably agree with me, is that these opt-outs really put a damper on it. When you look at the Florida Gators, all their top players opted out. And they lost really miserably to Oklahoma. You look at North Carolina, all their guys opted out except their stud quarterback. And they still almost beat Texas A&M. And poor Auburn, without their coach, they just didn't look like they needed to be in a bowl game. They got pretty much manhandled by Northwestern of the Big Ten. In Georgia, all their opt-outs, it really put a damper on it because Cincinnati, I don't know if they can play Georgia close if Georgia has all their players playing. You got to take that into account. I remember a couple of my friends called me over the weekend and said, Lee, why did this team beat that team and vice versa? And I'm like, well, you got to take into account. I mean, most of these teams, their top players did not even play. So you can't look at it like you do normally. And I just hope that in the future, kids look at the value of playing in a bowl game and not stopping playing during the season with their teammates and their coaches, at least for their teammates in their school. Because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and, everybody wanted to play in a bowl game. It meant something to kids to play in a bowl game. It meant something to their parents. It's a big deal. It's a big deal, to be on TV, and now it seems like the biggest deal is to be on TV to sign, for recruiting. But I think the media needs to start promoting how important bowl games are. And I don't think you need to start paying kids to play in a bowl game. A bowl game is a reward. It should be something that you'd want to do, and it's traditional. And you're on scholarship, and you have room and board. I mean, you have a cafeteria at these top 25 schools, like it looks like a Piccadilly, I mean, if you're a student athlete at a major university, you've got it pretty good overall. I mean, you're a kid going to college. Enjoy it. And don't go pro if you're not a first-round pick, because you're not going to be able to retire. Then you're going to need your scholarship. You're going to need your education. You're going to need your degree. We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we're going to go over all the bowl games. We're going to go over LSU basketball against Florida. I'll give my 2 cents about the basketball team. We'll talk about the national championship, Ohio State and Alabama. I think it's going to be a great game. And we'll talk about the LSU football players that are coming back and those that chose not to. You're listening to the Sports Scouting Report. I'm your host, Lee Burkeen. We'll be right back. Listen, whatever you're driving right now, Tommy Harvey wants it. Bring it in to Harvey Subaru, Lexus of Shreveport, Bossier City, or John Harvey Toyota. They're paying big bucks for all trades right now. They'll cut you a check right there. Tell them Lee sent you. Welcome back. You're listening to the Sports Scouting Report. I'm your host, Lee Burkeen. Today's topics, again, we're going to talk about the bowl games this segment. Next segment, we'll talk about LSU basketball, and then we'll end the show talking about LSU football, about how important it is for certain players to come back, those that have announced and those that have announced to not come back. And we'll talk about Eric Gilbert, how big of a loss that is for LSU. But let's continue with the bowl games as a topic this segment. You know, Alabama, I thought Notre Dame would give Alabama a game. I might have been the craziest person on the planet. I also picked Ohio State to win, which people thought I was crazy for that. But at least they got one out of the two right. I thought Clemson was overrated. I think quarterback Lawrence is a little overrated. He's not polished yet. I think people have been kind of hooked in on Clemson being there so much that they just go ahead and say, oh, they're going to win. But Clemson is not a program that's really had a lot of success lately in national championship games. I mean, that's 2 years in a row. Last year they lost to LSU for the national championship, and it wasn't even close. And this year it wasn't close. And they're getting some of the best talent in America, Dabo Swinney. And I can't say he's going to feel the heat, not for his job or anything, but his fan base has got to be a little upset that they're not competing at a high level like they did 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, or 5 years ago when all this started. And I think Watson, their quarterback, who's now at the Houston Texans, I think he brought that program to the level it's at. He was kind of like Joe Burrow to Clemson. Devontae Watson, their quarterback, was super special, and I think he still is. He's at least the backbone of the Texans and the NFL to build around him. But Clemson's missing something. They were a young team, kind of. Well, you can't say they're too young. They had Etienne come back. You had Lawrence come back as your third-year starting quarterback. And you had a lot of your guys back on the offensive line, and you had a lot of guys that came back on their D-line and linebacking core that had experience, and DBs. And so Clemson just signed their best recruiting class ever, but they've been signing them for 5 years now. But they look like they're a 3-touchdown difference from any of the top two programs. That's Alabama. I don't think they would have beat Oklahoma this year if Oklahoma would have played them. I don't know if Clemson would have beat Notre Dame again. Their offense is just not very difficult to figure out. And the ACC went 0 for 6 in bowl games. 0 for 6. By the way, the SEC went 6-2 in bowl games with all the opt-outs. Just imagine if Florida didn't have any opt-outs. Imagine if Auburn didn't have any opt-outs. If Anthony Schwartz would have played for Auburn, the star receiver there, Tank Bigsby, their running back, would have played. Just think if Florida would have had their receivers and Kyle Pitts. The SEC could have went 8-0. And even though they had opt-outs. Look at Mississippi State. I know it was Tulsa, but Tulsa had a good team. They beat Tulsa 28-26. I think Mike Leach did the regroup Coach of the Year award for the United States. I mean, he had 30 players opt out, kind of like LSU. Well, he kicked a lot of players off the team too. And he wins his bowl game basically playing his whole freshman class. Kylan Hill, his preseason All-American running back, did not play the whole year basically. They had a freshman quarterback, true freshman quarterback for Mississippi State that's going to be a really good player. And they've started to develop their whole freshman class. Mississippi State's going to do well next year. And Mike Leach, everybody was doubting him. You know, we're in that social world where you doubt people week to week in college football. But he showed that, hey, I'm going to, get rid of a lot of these bad eggs in the locker room. We're gonna play all these young guys. We're gonna stick to our game plan, and he finished pretty good at Mississippi State. And then you look at the Coach of the Year award in the SEC. I think it'll be Jimbo Fisher, obviously. Texas A&M, even though they struggled to beat North Carolina, I mean, Sam Howell, the quarterback for North Carolina, is phenomenal. I think he's another Ben Roethlisberger from the Pittsburgh Steelers. He reminds me so much of Ben. Big body quarterback, cannon arm. And when you look at the Florida Gators, losing Oklahoma, getting embarrassed, it's not just that game that hurt the program. LSU really broke their back. I mean, this was a team that was destined to go to the playoffs, even if they would have lost in Atlanta possibly. They would have went probably over Notre Dame, but LSU beats them with a 57-yard field goal by Cade York, and then the following week they get embarrassed in Atlanta. Well, they played Alabama pretty good in Atlanta, but they lose 3 games in a row. Their record is basically just like LSU's. LSU was 5-5. They had 4 losses. Isn't that crazy? At one time, Florida was the number 3 team in the United States. It's how you finish. And I think they would have probably played Oklahoma head-to-head if they had Kyle Pitts at tight end and all their top receivers, like Trevon Grimes and Tony, the skill player from Alabama that had such a great 3-4 years for that program. And then you look at Ole Miss beating Indiana. Indiana was one of the best teams in the United States. What does it say about LSU? LSU beats Ole Miss. Ole Miss turns around and beats Indiana, who had their best season in over 30 years. Kentucky beats North Carolina State, who really had, it's about even, the 2 programs. And Georgia beat Cincinnati. Cincinnati was a team that almost got maybe in the playoffs. If it wasn't for Notre Dame or A&M, they would have been that next team in. If there would have been 8 teams in a playoff bracket, if there would have been 8, Cincinnati would have been 6. Cincinnati didn't have a good quarterback in that game. I thought he was just a little tentative for Cincinnati. Cincinnati's defense was awesome. I think Marcus Freeman will make a great D coordinator. I hope LSU can get him to take the job this week. If Cincinnati would have had any offense in the second half, they would have beat Georgia. They actually out-physicaled Georgia. They beat Georgia in offense and defensive lines. They actually just didn't have a great game from their quarterback. Everybody saw that. And also in bowl games, Tulane lost their bowl game to Nevada. And ULL won their game over University of San Antonio, UTSA. And you know what? As great of a year as UL had, and Coach Napier, they got to get in a better bowl game setup because nobody hardly knew about the game, and it really wasn't a marquee game against UT San Antonio. I mean, I would have liked to seen UL play like a Kentucky. Wouldn't everybody listening would like the same thing? Like, let's see how good ULL would be playing Ole Miss in a bowl game or, Mississippi State. And then pull for the Cajuns to win. But UT San Antonio just didn't pull a lot of weight or viewers, outside of Louisiana maybe or San Antonio, Texas. I just think for the great season they had, this is the best bowl setup they have. It's not really great for recruiting outside of Louisiana. We're going to go take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about LSU basketball. They lost a tough game against Florida on the road, and Coach Mike White had a great game. I think he outcoached Will Wade in that one game. I love Will Wade. I'm a big fan of Will Wade, but he got outcoached in that game. We'll talk about that when we come back, and later in the show we'll talk about LSU opt-outs and how important it is certain players are returning for the 2021 season. That's right, 2021. We'll be right back. Looking for a used car? Harvey Autos has 3 dealerships, which means 3 times the used vehicles. They've got everything from fuel-efficient compacts to luxury models, even hybrids. and certified pre-owned with a warranty. Check out John Harvey Toyota, Harvey Subaru, or Lexus of Shreveport, Bossier City. Welcome back. You listen to the Sports Scouting Report. I'm Lee Burkeen, your host. We're going to go ahead and talk about the LSU basketball team. Before we do that, I want to give a shout-out to our sponsor, John Harvey Toyota. Hey, guys, just wanted to take a minute to tell you about Harvey Autos. If you need a new or used car, there's 3 great dealerships right here worth checking out. John Harvey Toyota, Harvey Subaru, and Lexus of Shreveport, Bossier City. Low prices, honest people. Tell them Lee sent you, and they are great people. Tommy's a great guy, the owner. They support high school football, all sports, and college athletics. Be sure to go check them out if you need a vehicle. Great people in Bossier City or Shreveport. We're going to continue on with LSU basketball. You know, I said on the podcast a week ago, I said that LSU had one glaring weakness. It was pretty easy to see, and a lot of people that know basketball saw it. This is a team with a lot of athletic players, and they had a lot of hype with all these 7-footers they brought in, but none of them are contributing. Josh Gray is a freshman from New York, 6'11", that's not playing. Obviously, he's not ready. Sharif O'Neal was hurt, 6'10". He was not really impressive to me in the games he played. He was a good rebounder, but he wasn't really an offensive threat. But at least he could have been around to play. You know, if he plays in this Florida game, at least he could be a 6'10" body to keep someone from just basically. It's like shooting basketball when you're growing up in a neighborhood with a bunch of friends and you pick the teams, you know, like 4-on-4, 5-on-5. And that big 6'4" guy that doesn't get on your team, he's the best player out of the 8 kids, and nobody can stop him. That reminds me of when I was a kid watching LSU Florida basketball over the weekend, because the 6'10" kid from Florida, Colin Castleton, who's a transfer from Michigan. And look, I'm not taking anything away from the kid. He scored 26 points against LSU. He's not going to be a first-round pick, okay? He might not even get drafted. But because he's 6'10" and he can shoot the ball 5 feet or less, he scored the first 9 points of the second half against LSU. They couldn't stop him. They didn't adjust to that. They don't have anybody with any height or any vertical that could stop him, and they were fouling him on top of that. But this is a preview of what's going to happen every week if you play a team that has any kind of power forward or big body down low or a true center that's 6'10", 6'11", like this Colin Castleton. LSU's going to get in foul trouble from fouling somebody like this, or they're just going to give up a lot of points, and they're going to be playing from behind, because if you're not hitting 12 threes a game, you're going to be losing by 10 points, 8 points with 3 minutes to go, like they were against Florida over the weekend. And Mike White saw that, and he attacked LSU in the second half, seeing that they couldn't stop anybody in the post down low. They've got to get it fixed. They either need to get Sharif O'Neal back just to be a big body to put on another big guy. Not that Sharif's a scoring machine, but at least to stop someone from dominating them on the boards. I mean, this guy was making shots under the basket that was like, it was like reliving my childhood with kids in the neighborhood. Like, you know, when I was growing up, I might have been 5'6", when I was 12, and some kid might have been 6 foot. It was just height. Nobody could stop, you know, that certain kid in the neighborhood. You remember that? Everybody's got these pickup games that play basketball. At least that's what I did when I was growing up in the neighborhood. But I felt like it's really demoralizing when you can't stop someone, and the guy's not even great. He's not even a great player. And when you play Tennessee, who's got a 6'10" power forward who's a little more seasoned, a little bit better player, or when you play Alabama and they've got a couple of 6'10s, And when you play even Kentucky, who's 2-7, they've got a couple of 6'10s, a 7-footer. How are you going to stop it? So Will Wade is going to have to come up with something and hopefully get Sharif O'Neal back, because Penn Johnson, who's a transfer from the University of Washington, a 7-footer, everybody was hyping him. He couldn't even get on the court the first 5 games because he just wasn't ready, and he's been out of school for like 2 years, out of high school. LSU did not pick up a big guy who's a difference maker. They just didn't get that big 6'10", 6'9" guy. They just don't have that guy on the roster. And then Trendon Watford is really like a 2-guard, and he's really 6'8". But he's not a guy to defend down low. And LeBlanc can end up being that, but he's only 6'7", even though his length is about 6'10". Can they fix it? Yeah, but it might be kind of tough. They might lose 2 or 3 games, 2 or 3 more games, because they can't stop anybody down low. I mean, this guy was shooting 2-foot shots just because he was taller. He was just putting it in the basket. I mean, it's tough to watch. I mean, LSU had the game in the first half, and they were leading 40-35, and then it tied at 40 at half, and then and then Coach White says, okay, we're going under the basket to this 6'11" guy. They can't stop it. Maybe Josh Gray can come in just to body up against guys, just to get some fouls, you know, so you don't get your whole lineup in foul trouble. Like LeBlanc fouled out. He didn't even play half the game. And Days was in foul trouble. Days had a horrible game. I thought Days, this is the kind of game you got to step up when you're a junior. I mean, Darius did not have a good game. By Darius only scoring 4 points, that's where LSU fell below in their production. And on top of that, Florida's best player didn't play, Deontay Johnson, because of the issues with him. Heck, the kid was basically in a coma about a week ago. Thank God he came out of that, and he had passed out on the court. It's been well documented, but he's on the side. He was on the court. I mean, he was on the bench with his team. That was good to see. But it's a big worry. Now, not everybody you play is going to be as good as Florida, but there are a lot of teams in the SEC that have a 6'9", 6'10" guy that can make buckets under the basket if you don't have somebody to defend. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the LSU football players that have decided to come back and how important that is for this team moving forward, for Ed Orgeron to try and compete for championships in 2021. We'll be right back. So, hey, guys, just wanted to take a minute to tell you about Harvey Autos. If you need a new or used car, there's 3 great dealerships right here worth checking out. John Harvey Toyota, Harvey Subaru, and Lexus of Shreveport, Bossier City. Low prices, honest people. Tell them Lee sent you. Welcome back. You listen to Sports Scouting Report. I'm Lee Burkeen, your host. This segment, our topic is LSU football. We're talking about the opt-outs or people that are coming back for next season, which is this season coming up. Eric Gilbert's put his name in the transfer portal, the big star tight end from Georgia, the best tight end supposedly ever signed by LSU. I kind of don't agree with that. I think David LaFleur was one of the best tight ends ever. He had injury problems. David LaFleur from Lake Charles, Westlake High School, 6'7", 260. But LSU didn't throw the ball to the tight end back then, and David had a lot of injury problems. He still went in the first round of the Dallas Cowboys. But I'm not, I've been around long enough to know that LSU has signed some good tight ends. Robert Royal was a great tight end from Edna Carr. They've had some good tight ends over the years. Malcolm Scott from St. Aug. Malcolm Scott was a phenomenal tight end. And, Foster Morrow. But gifted-wise, Eric Gilbert is definitely is the most gifted tight end, size-wise, speed-wise, to ever put on an LSU uniform. Hopefully the kid decides to come back. He announced he will transfer from LSU. And hopefully it won't be an opponent that LSU has to play. I mean, wouldn't it be something if he transfers to Georgia and then LSU has to play them in a game? And then he's the difference? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that happens. I mean, this guy, look, regardless of what happened or why he sat out the final 3 games of the season, this is a kid that would have had 50 catches for LSU if he wouldn't have sat out his final 3 games. He would have had 50 catches as a true freshman, which would have broken LSU record for a freshman tight end and would have been one of the best ever in the SEC. So it is a big deal if Eric Gilbert decides to leave LSU. It's a big deal. I mean, LSU bragged about him for a year, how great he was. You know, Ed was talking about how great he was. The team was talking about how great he was. And look, if you saw him play this past year, he was pretty good. He didn't look like a 17, 18-year-old true freshman at 6'5", 250, running a 4.5 in the 40 with great hands. And so you don't want this guy to go to a team that you got to play, especially Alabama. And if he's homesick, then obviously he'll go to Georgia. If he's just wanting to leave, then he might go to Tennessee, Alabama. He could end up in Florida. You never know where he's going to go. I mean, he can go anywhere. You can play right away. The new rule is the NCAA. You can play right away this 1 year and leave without sitting out. You don't need an appeal. You don't need anything. So this kid would be suiting up against LSU next year, possibly. And if they're Nick Saban, if he gets his kid, that would change his team next year. Or if Florida picked him up. And then, again, hopefully this kid will come back. I mean, I know COVID was tough this year for a lot of kids. I've talked to a lot of parents this year who have kids that play college football all over, small schools, big schools. It was tough on young people to try and deal with this COVID because college, they weren't able to have any fun. It was all locked down and stay in your apartment and stay away from people and no social environment. It wasn't your normal year for a college kid as a student or as a student athlete. But hopefully Ed Orgeron can convince this kid to come back still. I mean, he could change your team next year. You don't want to lose a tight end that can catch 50 passes in a season and could be a threat inside the 5 now that he's going to be an older kid next year. You don't want him going to another program that you're going to play. And you got to defend this kid. But talking about the players that are coming back for LSU, I think the biggest one that's announced he's coming back to LSU is Ed Ingram on the offensive line, offensive guard from DeSoto, Texas. I think Ed Ingram was not going to go high in the draft. So this is the kind of kid you got to get back. I mean, if you're not going to be a first, second round pick, you got to get these kids to come back. And I know you can see Ed's doing that. But Ed Ingram would probably be a 4th round, 5th round pick, and that's not a guarantee to make the money you could if you come back. Ed Ingram could be a 1st round pick. And realize one thing. Most of these kids who are coming back to LSU and a lot of the other programs, they were never really in good shape because of COVID for the season. They really never had a chance to train full time. And so a lot of these kids caught COVID and they missed weeks and months to train and lose weight. So there was no training hardly prior to this year. And Ed Ingram was not in the best shape of his life. He was in good shape, but he's got a chance to get in great shape and be a 1st-round pick offensive guard for LSU. And he could be the stalwart, the strength of this team. This team needs an offensive line. Look at all the offensive lines in the United States. Oklahoma was good because they had a great O-line. Alabama was good because they had a good O-line. Notre Dame was good because they had a good O-line. Ohio State, they've got a good offensive line. Clemson, all these top programs, Florida, they had very good offensive lines that allowed the quarterback to have time and the running backs to have holes to run through. It took pressure off the defense. We always talk more about these defenses, but if the offensive line is not really strong, your defense is going to really give up a lot of points because if you don't have a run game, you're not going to control the clock. And that's what Alabama did to everybody this year, is that you just couldn't stop their offense because their offensive line was too dominant. Chasen Hines has announced he's coming back from Marshall, Texas. He's a junior. You know, Chasen got hurt his first year at LSU. He limped off the field against Florida this year. I think Chasen Hines is another great example of a kid that wasn't able to condition himself before the season this year. He was carrying maybe 20 pounds of bad weight. And again, Chasen's got an NFL future if he can get back into great shape, which he can if the world we live in can go back to normal for this coming spring or by the summer, where these kids can actually train, eat right, and have a normal life. Ali Gay has decided to come back. Here's another kid that just needs another year of fine-tuning, a little tweak here and there, a little bit more muscle, maybe a little bit more strength. Ollie's about 6'7", 6'6.5", about 262, but I think if he gets up to about 272, and he looks lean. And he runs about a 4.6 40. But here's a kid, if he can put on a little more mass and just, he's learned the game a little bit. He's got so much left to learn. You know, Ollie Gay wasn't going to be a first, second round pick. He was going to be one of those third or fourth round picks. So it's a great get him back. And Ollie could be a first round pick next year. He really could be. And he could be a pass rusher for LSU. He was a good one this year, but I think he's got a chance to be great. And then Andre Anthony came into his own this year, the Edna Carr native from Algiers, 6'4", about 245, 250 now, 255. I think Andre Anthony hasn't hit his full potential, and that's, again, another good decision to come back. You know, Andre could play at around 270 and still be fast. He showed a lot of pass rush ability this year, and against the run. He really started to look good. Never count kids out, because sometimes you might think they're not going to be any good for the first year or two, but especially offense and defensive linemen, sometimes it takes a little while to get to where you need to be, and linebackers. And then Neil Farrell announced he's coming back at defensive tackle, the really good player. You know, Neil was out of shape because he had opted out for a while because he had some family members dealing with COVID in Alabama. And Neil was never in shape this year. Again, he wasn't in the condition he needed to be in, and he played hard. I mean, that Ole Miss game, he played lights out against Ole Miss this year. I think he played every snap on defense, which is hard for a guy at 315 pounds. Neil Farrell could be I don't think he'd be a first-round pick, but he could be a second, third-round pick. And it was very smart for Neil to come back because he might not even have got drafted. And he's a good player. I think Liam Shanahan announcing he's coming back, the center from Harvard. If you know football, you can't really fully say that Liam was a bust because he never played center before, and he did that for LSU, okay? So a lot of people don't realize that. At Harvard, he was a tackle and a guard. To play center is hard. It's really a hard spot to play. And by week 7, week 8, he started looking good. He had a great game at Florida. He was really doing great against Florida. He had a great game against Ole Miss. And he was coming into his own. So I think Liam Shanahan could be a high draft pick. He could be a third, fourth round guy. Maybe a second round pick. I mean, he's got that kind of ability. He's strong, benches about 450. He's about 6'3", 6'4", about 300 pounds. I mean, the guy never played center before. I mean, LSU had players playing positions that they'd never played because they had no one else. And so really the last big-time player they're waiting on to announce he's coming back, and he should because he's not going to get drafted high. And if he comes back, I think he could be a high draft pick, is Dare Rosenthal from Faraday High School. LSU's left tackle who's 6'7", about 330, 340. And he started to come into his own against Ole Miss in Florida. The light came on, you could tell. But if Dare Rosenthal goes in the draft, he might not even get drafted. If he comes back, he could be a high draft pick because he's starting to show it. But scouts need to see that over a full season. And that's for most of these guys I just talked about. And then Glenn Logan, you know, he's a senior from Destrehan High School, D-tackle. He was never in great shape this year because of COVID. Again, all these guys. And Glenn didn't have a great year. He fought hard. He played hard for LSU. And I really admire Glenn Logan, what he did, and Neil Farrell. I mean, they played just about every snap the last 3 games of the season, which is hard to do for a big guy on D-line. But Glenn Logan would be good by coming back for LSU because he might not get drafted. And he's a guy that when he's in shape and when he's healthy, he could be a second, third round pick type of player. Probably third round, maybe fourth round. And what's good, these are linemen. These are guys you got to get them back because you need depth. If you want to have any chance to beat Alabama next year, to go to Atlanta or Auburn, who shouldn't have beat them this year, you got to have a great D-line and an O-line. You've got to have those big guys in the trenches, and you got to have depth because you're going to have injuries. And so what Orgeron needs to do now is he needs to get the young guys to all come back. You can't lose any more guys in that 2020 class. You got to keep those guys together. I mean, they might lose Gilbert, but they can't lose any more players out of that 220 group. They've got to build the team back. They've got to build some depth. And that's what hurt Orgeron this year. Not just the opt-outs and the juniors going pro, but he lost a lot of young guys from his 2018 and 2017 classes. They weren't there for leadership. The older guys were not on the team. He lost most of those classes. He's got to keep these guys on the team. He's got to find a way to manage this team. And he's got to hire the right offensive coordinator and the right defensive coordinator. And they need a spring. They need a spring because they're still young. But at least they'll have more depth, hopefully, if they can keep this team together. He's got talent, but he's got to keep the guys on the team, in the program, in school. Whatever LSU needs to do, they got to find a better way to roster manage this program. Because this is going to be long-term for Ed Orgeron, the head coach. He can't just build for 1 year. He's got to build for a long time like Nick does. And, you know, even Coach Kelly at Notre Dame, even though that Notre Dame can't compete with Alabama, they build teams. Dabo Swinney at Clemson, they build teams. Ohio State, they build teams. They build depth after depth. They have second and third team. They have a true third team. LSU's having to play everybody on their roster because they don't have any depth. And moving forward, they got to find a way again to keep these guys in the program. Because, look, COVID happened to all these kids all over the United States, every school. And there were schools that were able to manage it a little bit better. All the opt-outs for Ohio State ended up opting back in. Clemson didn't lose anybody. Neither did Alabama. That's why those guys are in the playoffs. And to get in the playoffs, you got to keep your team together. You can't keep losing these recruits because if you're ranked high, what does it matter if you can't keep them on the team? I mean, how good would LSU have been if a lot of your top young recruits like Marcel Brooks, he was a 5-star player in 2019, he's gone. He wasn't around for this year. He could have played some safety, could have played some linebacker, could have rushed the passer. You can't lose players like that. You know, the Starks kid, the linebacker from John Ehret, he was one of the up-and-coming young linebackers for the program. He was out of the program for this year. You've got to keep your best players in the program, and you can't say next man up because you don't have enough talent. So are you recruiting good? Yeah, you got to keep the guys on the team. Again, it doesn't matter if you finish number 1 in the country in recruiting if a year later you've got 9 kids out of the program from the class. You got to keep these guys on your program, in your team. Now, there is attrition where you tell guys not to come back because they're just not good enough, or you don't need them if you're keeping the other players on the team, if you're keeping your depth with good attrition. Bad attrition is when you're losing players that you don't want to lose. And somehow Orgeron's got to reverse that. As a staff, they've got to manage that better. You can't just put 22 guys out on the field on a 12-week season and expect to not have injuries, and you don't have no depth. But I want to applaud all those kids for LSU that stuck it out this year. When you watch the Ole Miss game and you watch the Florida game, I mean, basically the same 25 to 30 kids played the whole game. That includes special teams. Kudos to those kids. They stuck it out. They won. They beat a number 6 team on the road in Gainesville, which is nobody. I mean, that was the most craziest game ever. I've never seen an LSU team with less than 50 players, basically, before the game was even over, be able to beat a team with 80 kids who only had a loss going into the game. And only trailed, they didn't trail at halftime to anyone this year, Florida, until LSU beat them. And LSU was ahead of them at halftime. I think that goal line stand against Florida was incredible this year. A lot of people kind of forget about that. With the Heisman Trophy quarterback. And you know, Pelini, you know, if LSU beats Missouri and they beat Mississippi State, take care of business, and he's probably still on the staff, and so is the staff. But, you know, when you have a bad year, you know, people lose their jobs. And hopefully LSU will straighten it out for the future. Because if you don't get to stay at an SEC school very long. It's big money, big business. But I would love to see LSU get longevity, change the culture, and keep kids on this team, keep kids in school. They've got to have that moving forward. I hope everybody enjoyed the show. I hope everybody's having a great Monday. We'll see you Wednesday, and I hope everybody, again, see you soon. And glad that we could do the show today on Monday. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you Wednesday.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Scouting Report podcast with Lee Brackeen.